So good morning, everyone. We are just going to wait 1 or 2 minutes while participants are progressively getting in the meeting. Welcome to this webinar on the EU forced labor regulation and its impacts on the cocoa sector, which is organized by the International Cocoa Initiative, together with the European Cocoa Association, CAOBISCO, the Voice Network, and the Cocoa Coalition. I am Mathias Lange, I'm the Executive Director of the ICI, and I'm just going to give a few minutes of intro. So first of all, we can start with the technical elements. This is a webinar format, so please put any question that you have in the Q&A function, and they will be taken on board. I mean, we will unfortunately not be able to take off all of the questions considering the time we have, but a few of them will be selected and passed to our various speakers and panelists by the moderators of that session. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, including for our friends on the other side of the Atlantic who are interested in the subject matter and may want to get inspiration from the EU at some point, maybe. But obviously our timing is not very US friendly. So on that, I think we are all good on the technical elements. I suggest we just wait 1 or 2 more minutes. People are still getting in, and then we can crack on. So yes. So just maybe on the organization of the webinar, we will first hear from 3 distinguished guest speakers. Afterwards, we will take a few questions for them, and then we will move in a roundtable discussion, which is going to be moderated by Duncan Brack, who is the facilitator of the Cocoa Coalition. So on that, let's crack on. So maybe just to give a bit of background on the subject for today, I guess most of you, if you are attending this webinar, are familiar with the cocoa sector. But so as you know, therefore, the majority of the world's cocoa is produced by smallholder farmers who grow cocoa on small plants of land. And like in many agricultural supply chains, it's important to remind ourselves that forced labor and child labor, which are the 2 most salient human rights issues in the cocoa sector, are very different issues. So while some of the underlying causes may be the same, they are defined differently, they occur at very different scales, and as such, they also need to be tackled in different ways. And that's why we also welcome the fact that there are various pieces of legislation in the pipeline at the EU level, and one being the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and the other one being this forced labor regulation. So sometimes it's always good to start with a bit of definition. So as a reminder, forced labor is work that is done involuntarily and under the threat of a penalty. What this means in cocoa, for instance, can be a worker who is doing a task that he or she did not originally agree to, and at the same time being threatened, such as not being paid or the retention of ID documents. In terms of scale, forced labor is far less prevalent than child labor in the cocoa supply chain. According to the estimates of the World Free Foundation, forced labor affects less than 1% of the children working in cocoa growing areas in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and less than 0.4% of adults working in cocoa. But in any case, while there are different issues occurring at different scales, we need to be tackled in different ways. Both of those elements absolutely need to be tackled. And that's why we support the European Commission commitment to tackle this issue, and we support the objectives of the legislation. Forced labor is an absolutely egregious human rights issue, and we therefore welcome the proposal that has been put forward by the Commission. But while there are many important elements and important tools that are foreseen by this regulation, we have obviously a number of elements that we'd like to stress, and I'm sure that some of our speakers and panelists will come back to some of them later on. One of them being that we want, considering the very different nature of the two issues and the very different scale, to make sure that the majority of cocoa farmers are not penalized for the action of the few. So as such, it will be crucial for us to clarify when shipments, when products can be seized, what is the threshold, what is the evidence required. Very importantly, we want absolutely see provisions for the remediation of cases of forced labors. And we also need to be clear what kind of remedy, what kind of support companies should provide if cases of forced labor are identified. Most importantly, we want to ensure that any regulation promotes engagement with cocoa farmers in a genuine effort to eradicate forced labor, but doesn't incentivize companies to abandon sourcing areas where there are known risks. And finally, we just need to remember that legislation is one piece of the puzzle, but there are responsibilities for all actors involved, including companies, but also importantly, governments who have a duty to protect their citizens and to support victims. And for that reason, we would very much like to see the EU provide support to producing countries. So on those few words of introduction, let me most importantly turn to our panelists and keynote speakers who will give an overview of the proposed legislation before we move into the panel discussion later in the session. So I'd like to introduce Madeleine, if she's joined us, from the European Commission DG Trade, as well as Samira Rafaela, who is a member of the European Parliament and importantly co-rapporteur of this legislation, and Lene Wendland, who is the Chief Business and Human Rights at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and who is also a board advisor to the International Cocoa Initiative. So without further ado, I think we are still waiting for Madeleine, so I suggest that we start by Samira. Samira, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction and good morning to you all. Very happy to speak about this very important topic. This is all part of how Europe is changing as a trading partner, as an economic partner in the world. And we are building on value-based and rules-based trade. And we would like to be a credible voice also in the world when it comes to doing trade, when it comes to the economic partnerships that we are trying to close. So I'm very happy to be the international trade coordinator for Renew Europe, also for the Liberals in the European Parliament, where we are very much trying to build on more instruments that are part of an assertive trade toolbox. We are building on more trade agreements, making sure that these trade agreements have respect and integrate climate standards, human rights standards, even gender equality standards. So this is a very interesting and I would say a nice time to be in the European Parliament and to work on trade-related aspects. We were very much waiting for the European Commission to come with the proposal on the forced labor ban instrument. I was really excited about it personally. Last year, we did a resolution on ourselves in the European Parliament, where we already communicated proactively also to the European Commission our priorities. We were very much hoping that it would be a specific, a special instrument that will focus only on targeting forced labor. And what is very good about this proposal is that it's very focused, first of all, on the product. So it's a product-based approach, it's a risk-based approach, but obviously it needs to take an economic incentive for companies to keep working and keep dealing with products coming forward out of forced labor. So yes, this is not the silver bullet. This is not going to solve, I believe, the whole issue of forced labor, but it's definitely going to target an incentive significantly, so that we hope to prevent more people from becoming a victim of forced labor. So this is what I, as co-rapporteur, together with Maria Manuel from the IMCO committee, are hoping for, and that we are satisfied about. So, first of all, forced labor is a human rights violation, and we should effectively help to put a stop to the exploitation of human beings. So yes, this is also a very technical discussion, like how are we going to ban products from our market? But it's also a human rights issue, and it should apply to all products, irrespective of the company size. And we need to see in the first place how we are going to make sure that this product is a very strong technical instrument. Well, first, one of the main powers of the ban will be the database. So this database needs to include information on geographical areas, on the risk products, on the gendered impact of forced labor, in my opinion, but also remediation. And the database needs to be easily accessible to the competent authorities and to the general public. So on the longer term, this information needs to become public, especially when an investigation is closed and when we find an outcome that was negative. So this is really important, this database, for people to know where the products are coming from, and companies will need to avoid appearing on this list. Then what is very important is that it is linked to the issue of remediation. Like, we cannot build a strong instrument without teeth. So this is very key to me, as it will ensure that a real and sustainable solution is given to forced labor causes and to the victims of forced labor. I also think that this kind of information needs to be in the database, whether remediation has taken place effectively, because we do need to have a longer term effect of this instrument, and remediation is part of that. It's also very important that especially the vulnerable groups, I mean, as a victim, you're already vulnerable, but we also identify extra vulnerable groups. Take, for example, whistleblowers, that they have the protection that they need, and that also the vulnerable groups and all the victims have the correct information on where they need to apply for a complaint or where they need to go to. Then we should also consider a reverse burden of proof on companies, but we should avoid the unnecessary burden on companies. So the discussion now, of course, is about the SMEs. This is why the co-rapporteurs really would like to integrate guidelines and create guidelines for the support for specifically SMEs. That will be of great importance. And the reverse burden of proof needs to be related to the high-risk products. Then we should also think and see how we can make sure that this legislation is gender mainstreamed. So we need gender mainstreaming and differentiated intersectional impact also of the instrument when it comes to different groups in society. Take, for example, children, women, migrants, refugees, or indigenous people. And that will be one of our main priorities, to make sure that the information about them is being mainstreamed, that we integrate that also for the solutions and for the remediation. Because what we see now is that there are some weaknesses when it comes to the forced labor ban proposal, and that is, for example, that it does not take into account gendered and intersectional impact of forced labor. So in the draft proposal, we are trying to strengthen this. And to really create systemic and long-lasting change, it is very important to include also the access to remediation for victims in the proposal. So that is also what we're trying to strengthen in the proposal, because we see now that this is not the strongest part of the proposal. And what is also a point of attention is the harmonization among the member states and the bigger role for the Commission that will be important for the implementation of the proposal. So this is also what we are trying to look for strengthening when it comes to strengthening in the forced labor ban proposal. I believe that this instrument, in relation to, of course, the due diligence proposal, will be a full package, I believe, for companies to make sure that they behave in an ethical way. I think it is a really it's really adding value to what we are trying to achieve now with due diligence. We had the vote last week, and through this instrument, we can really target specifically the issue of forced labor and also the issue of forced child labor. So this is so far my presentation. We are now in the phase of the amendments. We have over 700 amendments that we need to scrutinize and screen now and analyze to see where the main issues will be. You can expect the main issues to be at the point of the SMEs, of course, but also when it comes to remediation. And we will have an interesting discussion about the value versus the supply chain. I do have a preference for speaking about the value chain because I think that gives us broader opportunities. It gives a broader scope also for the investigation, but also for us to target, for example, the working conditions and labor rights and so on. So I'm very much looking forward to our further discussion on this topic, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Samira. That was very concise, but at the same time extremely precise and insightful. So Madeleine, I'm sure you've heard Samira explain to which extent this regulation was a specific request from the European Parliament, who called for a specific instrument on forced labor, but also what are all the elements that the European Parliament would like to see on the implementation of such legislation, the importance of a database, the importance of access to remediation guidelines to support companies, the protection of victims, the specific attention to be given to vulnerable groups. So maybe over to you now so that you can also tell us and all the attendees what are the main elements that are currently contained in that legislation. So Madeleine, over to you.
Speaking, but do you see me?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Hello. Good morning. Sorry, I jumped in, but I did, Samira. I have to thank you because you've quite well also entered into the politics of it, but certainly also the technical details. So first of all, thank you very much to be here with you. I'm Madeleine Tuininga, Head of Unit in DG Trade. We deal with the whole agenda of trade and sustainable development, so all the aspects from labor, human rights issues to environmental and climate issues. And within that, we have a focus on the external aspects of autonomous measures, so EU internal, the Green Deal, but certainly also this one, and the multilateral, plurilateral aspects. So in this case, actually, we are co-lead of this piece of legislation together with DG Grow. That was decided that we had to do it together. Yes, you're right. This was indeed, as we know, a long-awaited proposal that the President of the Commission asked for forced labor ban to put on the table, meeting inter alia requests also of the Parliament, but so certainly also because part of our whole agenda is to have a strong sustainability angle in that. And maybe then to skip a couple of things, because I think a lot has already been highlighted, but what I wanted to say is there are two important aspects. So the first one is that we do not start from scratch, and linked to that is that, of course, including for forced labor, there's quite a development of EU legislation that is also relevant for this, and international action, which is we've been pushing already for a long time, but which we are intensifying now. So within the EU, of course, what is important to bear in mind is that this is not the first piece of legislation that affects human rights and including forced labor. We have, starting already with the conflict mineral regulation, the due diligence legislation, another piece of due diligence not yet enforced. Conflict minerals is enforced, but less relevant for your sector, of course. But we have also the CSDDD, so the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, currently in the Parliament, but which is going to establish mandatory due diligence requirement. And beyond that, there are several pieces of legislation that in one or another way affect labor rights. So it is important to bear that in mind, because when we were developing this due diligence, this forced labor ban, a ban is a ban. So the idea was not that this would be due diligence legislation. So we had to find a way to not duplicate or do things of due diligence where whilst implementing the mandate to do a ban. You see the result there. So there's no legal obligation to do due diligence under this proposal, but we find a way to recognize that that is taking place. And that makes also sense, an eminent sense, because what we've learned for all these complex questions that go in the supply chain, that also go into the fifth or the sixth tire in your supply chain, due diligence actually matters to find out what is happening there. And it's also multiplier effect. We cannot put all police agents in the EU and at the border to smell whether a product has forced labor. You need to figure out, has forced labor taken place? And due diligence can be an important part, at least for companies, to know their supply chain. So prominence to this is given in the first phase, what we call the pre-investigation, where a company may come up with what he or she has done in due diligence. So to mark the ban, at the same time, if you come up with due diligence, it's not a free card. You cannot say, look, I've done my duty of care. Yes, oh no, there's forced labor, but I don't have a result obligation. No, a ban is a ban. So a product is banned, but by sort of creating this space to first enter into good practices that have taken place in due diligence, we would imagine that if it comes to the point that forced labor is detected, those who do due diligence, they do not, or generally companies should not want to have that. So you will want to repair it. And that's in one of the articles, 4.6, we define and determine that interface where we say, well, in that case, you need to, if you take urgent action to resolve the issue, then we don't move to the next stage of what we call substantiated concern, which leads to an investigation. So grosso modo, there is an interaction with other pieces of legislation. We cannot solve everything here. Also, in terms of developing this instrument internally, what has been important, and I think the general sort of camps in the extreme, or camps if you want, is do you first ask then shoot, or first shoot then ask, and a bit of the carrot and stick exercise. And we had to navigate a bit there. Because from, I think, across the spectrum, not only international organizations like the ILO, but also NGOs, the demand is, yes, we need an instrument with teeth, but we should not isolate countries. Often when forced labor takes place, you're talking about a country where workers are in difficult situations. So how can we help them? Because disengagement and completely withdrawing from a country is actually often not helping the worker in the country. It re-emphasizes a regime that may be in place or practice that may be in place. So that has been throughout the proposal. And this is also part of the reason why we say, well, first have a dialogue to find it out and try to, at all stages in implementation of your tools, to see, can we get to the root cause of this problem? So the balances, where's the carrot and the stick? And then I think, Samia, you mentioned it also. It needs to be, of course, doable in the way you do it. Not at the start overload the ball. That's certainly what we have wanted to focus. So that means also in the terms of scope, it needs to be focused, and the requirements that we impose, and that we don't do overlap that pertain to another field. And in the vein of that, actually, one of the questions you posed to me is, so remedies, yeah, that is, I am aware, or we are aware, actively discussed in the Parliament. The reason for not having included it in the Commission proposal is actually that, as for us being that is the field of due diligence, and we have not wanted to arrange due diligence in this proposal, and there are other areas where that should be taken up. That has been the reason for not including that. So I think you have a pretty good overview of what, let me see in terms of, before turning to the international side, but So in the proposal, and I saw that also in your agenda for the meeting, maybe a few clarifications. So it is about EU manufactured products for domestic consumption, but also for export and imported products. So there's no discrimination. We felt that was actually very important, other than some other legislation which only focus on imports. We want to send a signal this is a global issue. Very important for us has been that it's built on international standards. So in the design of the legislation, we use international standards, but this will also be our guiding principle when we implement the legislation. This is important for acceptability internationally, and important to be able to team up with other countries. Another important thing we've looked at is that we want a risk-based enforcement. This reflects also a bit of the focus we want. Let's start with the sectors, areas where the biggest risks are. And then, so this is the enforcement that will be carried out by member states, but in cooperation with all national authorities and with the Commission, of course. The Commission has a strong coordinating role. We've wanted to give due consideration to SMEs. The ban is a ban, so it's difficult to distinguish and say we carve out SMEs. No, a ban is a ban, so also SMEs are covered. But we, through guidelines and sort of the risk-based enforcement and the priority setting, we should help, be able to help SMEs. So Samira already took us through a couple of important tools. And these are, I would say, even more important than before. And it's not unique to forced labor, but if you look at the legislative initiatives over the last, say, 4 years, maybe 3 years, including the Green Deal, a lot is dealing with actually how products are produced. A lot is about requirements that go through supply chain that traditionally or in the past, not all companies would know. They may know what's happened in the second or third tier, but after that, a lot claim it's difficult to deal with that. Now, you see in some sort of risk sectors, most those who've been subject to a lot of consumer pressure, you see that they have actually advanced a lot in the textile sector, traceability initiatives, all kinds of labeling initiatives, certificate initiatives. So there is a certain sector, certainly, and I would say also in your sector, the cocoa sector, and you know that we have the cocoa initiative, for example, with a few African countries. There's very good work on the rails, but generally, the big challenge is that you cannot smell whether a product is made with forced labor or was made contaminating the environment. So that really requires us, and also for member states, to acquire actually new skills. So the first reaction of some may be, "Oh, I'm never able to do that." But the question is not whether, but how, and what type of tools should we develop. So this is why we've thought a lot about the tools. The database, Samira already referred to it, that for us has been key, and the rationale behind it is that the only way to help competent authorities and companies is to say, look, we are going to put in a database that is not having a legal consequence, but it is going to be risk indicators on the basis of publicly available sources. So the idea is that an external support will collect all of that and put it in a database, so that we help and assist countries in the risk management, and knowing whether there's a forced labor risk or not. And the idea is that is filled in both at country level, region level, and at product level. That makes, and the other important point that we wanted to make sense, it has to be public. So it is really a new adventure that we are taking. I don't think that any such database exists embedded in the legislation. Even not the US, they have a sort of database, they have a report, but it's not linked to the legislation. That has emerged as a sui generis exercise. So it needs to be objective, factual, and objectively verifiable. And at some point down the road, I see that also in other areas, we will need to cater for and take account of data protection issues. So the database is indeed a very important one, because that could generally have the power, the consequence. So I don't want to, there's no, at least in the Commission proposed, no legal consequence of it, for the reason that I say, because otherwise you need to change the nature of it, because then you need to really be sure that of the information that you've put in the legislation. But it is one of the important sources that could lead to the first step of an investigation, which is the first step, the pre-investigation, which is a reasonable suspicion to open an investigation. Other important sources will be, for example, complaints or submissions from stakeholders, or maybe information that we get from collaboration with other countries. The database. So the other really important tool will be guidelines. So we have in mind to do guidelines for competent authorities and guidelines for companies. And these, we are now in reflection, but what we have in mind is there needs to be a part on due diligence, how a checklist, or how do we expect due diligence to be carried out. And it needs to have any other information that makes it useful for competent authorities to implement it and companies to know. We find this particularly important because this is an important vehicle for third countries to know what is expected from EU companies and how will competent authorities operate, which gives a certain transparency for third countries to prepare and make sure that they can continue to meet the expectations also after this legislation of EU operators. These guidelines we have in mind to develop that in a very transparent way. So the moment the legislation is in force, we have in mind to have extensive consultations on this, both with member states, but certainly also with operators interested, and you could be a good group for that. And if you have ideas, don't hesitate to send it already. Then the third tool is a network of member states' competent authorities. So member states are in charge of the enforcement. That doesn't mean that the Commission has no role. On the contrary, it will be very important to make use of the full capacity within the EU by having regular exchanges. There will be an IT tool among member states to communicate on cases, on anything related to their work or investigations. And in that sense, this will also be a real network where we would have in mind that could be an interface if we find it useful to invite external experts, be it, I don't know, it could be a civil society, it could be third country representative, etc. And then the third point, what I would consider also a tool, is our collaboration with third countries. And this may be also a good moment to say, I said in the beginning, this is not a proposal in isolation, and we don't start from zero. Internationally, we have already a very intense collaboration with the ILO. We even have a project to implement all core labor standards. We work a lot on GSP and FTAs. So there is already a very good infrastructure. And this is only intensifying with this, because also for the ILO, this is an interesting opportunity to promote international standards and the work on this. So within the ILO, that we have a good strand, and we have already quite a long-standing collaboration with the US and also Canada on these matters. And of course, also with countries that are having forced labor. Now, to zoom in on Canada and the US, one of the tools that we have in mind is that we need to look at develop a mechanism where we create, I would say, a safe space to be able to exchange with the US authorities, who are also in charge of implementing their legislation, likewise Canada. So that le moment venu, if there is issues on particular cases to be exchanged, of course, that's very sensitive, but we have in mind that we would then create a mechanism where the Commission would coordinate that the member states that have a stake or interest can chip in. So we need to see that all this needs to be developed, but there's certainly a desire on both the US side, but also Canada and our side to find a way to create such a space. So that is sort of the mechanisms. I think just to briefly recap the sequencing in the proposal. So number one, there's a submission, there are indicators, there is a database of information. If that leads to a reasonable suspicion that there's forced labor, you get in the phase of a preliminary phase. That phase consists of a space for dialogue to find out what has happened. The company can show that it has not done, that there's no forced labor, likely going to bring forward due diligence, but if there are other means to show that, that is also possible. Then if that phase leads to a substantiated concern, then a formal investigation starts. And if there is evidence, then this leads to a decision consisting of a marketing prohibition and a request to withdraw the products from the market. So if this pen was identified with in a particular investigation as being found in violation of the regulation, this ban is requested to be withdrawn, but all these pens, also from other companies, are prohibited. So it is not a specific one single product withdrawal, but it is actually for all these pens. And then there are tools that we have to make sure and facilitate life of inter-alia customs people to know how do I figure out whether I find more of these pens. And then so that gets you then to the enforcement at the EU border. Very important concept here, because I find that there is often a bit of a confusion on the discussion on reversal burden of proof. And I'm saying that because even in a normal court case, it is not static. You put something forward, somebody else has to react. So for example, you can even argue when you get into a reasonable suspicion in the first preliminary stage, it will be for the company to show, no, there's no forced labor, because the competent authority comes up with, yeah, I have a reasonable suspicion. And likewise, in the investigative stage, it is not static that the company can sit there and say, I'm not going to give you any information, so I'm not going to have an investigation. No, and we've reinforced that because we say that if there's no non-cooperation, and this non-cooperation is either by economic operators, so the one who's sitting, I don't want to collaborate, or a third country government. We have in mind a certain country that is unlikely to want to give access to certain regions of it. So a company or a competent authority, if they're not cooperating, the competent authority can take its decision on the basis of facts available. And facts available is as much as you're in the database. So the discussion on reversal burden of proof is sort of irrelevant for this, because you take facts available and you don't need to wait for an evidence. So that has been our way of dealing with that and softening the requirements where it really needs to be softened, because you have a non-cooperating company or non-cooperating government. So I think I took you broadly. I'm looking at whether there could be other things that I should highlight, but I think this is the most important that I wanted to say. So if there are questions, I'm happy to. The next step, I think Samir has already said it. Of course, we're in the hands of the Council and the Parliament. With the Parliament, there's been already quite intensive work. There's a resolution. We've had presentations. We have technical workshops. We've had discussions in INTA, very constructive, we find. And many committees are interested. It's an INTA, IMCO, probably mirroring the Commission, also the two thighs. INTA, IMCO, so Internal Market and Trade, but we've appeared in many committees, Employment Committee, Human Rights, so there's a big interest. In the Council, we could have seen more activity. We've understood that, so we've had one meeting with the Council. The Council needs to determine its common position. And we understand from Spain that they want to organize another meeting still in July. And so it will depend a little bit how we can take this up. As you know, there's a huge flow of legislation getting to the committee in charge of this, which is the Competitiveness Council. So it is a bit juggling with all multiple priorities. But we hope to be able to intensify that, because then you get into the regular legislative stages that you have a council common position, and you have the position of the Parliament, and then ultimately you get to the stage of negotiating what we call the trilogue, so negotiating the ban. And then up to Samira to say how this could still happen. And then there are two options. Are we in time ready to do this before under the current legislation? So that would need to be in spring next year. And if not, then we move to the next parliament, which brings along natural delays because you need to have the committees and everybody established. They may need to have a fresh look at it, or maybe that depends then also on Samira, how she can consolidate the positions of parliament also for the next parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. That was very comprehensive, very useful, and you've even managed to already answer some of the questions in the Q&A in your remarks. And now, last but not least, I'm going to turn to the guardian of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, Lene, who's going also to tell us also a bit from the OHHR perspective, how that regulation fits with the UNGP. Lene, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I'm very pleased to be here, and I would like to start by congratulating the EU institutions in attempting a very ambitious legislative agenda for responsible business conduct, including business and human rights. I'm acutely aware of the political challenges and the sensitivities and appreciate the serious efforts that we've already heard of from the previous speakers. So at the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, we're following these developments closely, and we've been actively engaging, particularly on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which has already been mentioned. But the topic of this proposed regulation is, of course, of also immense importance, given the imperative that we at the UN Human Rights Office clearly shares of seeking to eradicate the scourge of forced labor. So we do plan to come out shortly with a short note in which we provide some further comments on some of the pertinent issues related to the proposed regulation. So I won't go into all the details in this presentation, also for time reasons. This note will be, as we've done with other pieces of regulation in different places of the world, is part of our global mandate to advocate for alignment of policies and regulations and alignment with international human rights standards, which in this context notably means aligning with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, but of course also the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises and relevant ILO instruments. In the interest of time, I'll focus on just a few issues, namely the issue of access to remedy, on stakeholder engagement, protecting people from risks of retaliation, and alignment with the CS3D. Some of these issues have already been referred to, and of course I could pick up on a number of other issues that have been referred to, but for now I'll just focus on those. I will just say, and it goes to the point made by Madeleine about alignment with international standards. And we see that the proposed regulation does make reference to the presence of a number of international standards that would be relevant to the work of competent authorities and which should be taken duly into account. The UN Guiding Principles would certainly be among those standards, especially as far as assessing the quality of a company's human rights due diligence where that is concerned. But we would suggest that given the foundational nature of UNGPs with respect to human rights due diligence and the broader space of preventing and mitigate human rights risks, including forced labor, it would be preferable if they were mentioned explicitly. But first, access to remedy. As we've heard, it doesn't provide, the proposed regulation doesn't provide for remedies for forced labor as such. Instead, it's designed to be complementary to other EU legislation prohibiting forced labor, which does establish legal liability for business actors, as well as the forthcoming CS3D. That said, the prospect of removal of products from the EU market does provide powerful incentives for EU economic actors to take robust preventative action to ensure that there is no forced labor in their supply chains, which can be regarded as a form of forward-looking remedy. However, the lack of provision in the proposed regulation for the possibility of corrective orders by competent authorities, for example, as an alternative to orders to prohibit or remove products, or as an interim measure, or indeed to negotiated action plans, for example, under which a company could agree to monitor the process to address forced labor in the supply chain, are perhaps missed opportunities to contribute to the delivery of remedies directly to affected people. As some of you may know, at the UN Human Rights Office, we have run a 9-year project mandated by the Human Rights Council on the issue of accountability and remedy in the context of the UN Guiding Principles. We have a lot to say on that issue, but for this, I would just maybe refer to the second phase of this project, which focused on what would be in this regulation, the competent authorities, and where we looked into in detail the multifaceted role that these competent authorities could play under the regulation with respect to remedy. And I would, we will make reference to that in our forthcoming note, and I would really strongly encourage the co-regulators to look closely at the guidance, because we do think that there are untapped potential for getting more into the detail based on this guidance that, as I mentioned, have been mandated and produced and welcomed by the UN Human Rights Council. Another point I just want to flag here is the issue of engagement with stakeholders, proper engagement with stakeholders aligned with internationally recognized rights of public participation is fundamental to the operation of human rights respecting processes by competent authorities. However, in our view, the approach of the draft regulation to stakeholder engagement is very weak. Indeed, there are few references to stakeholder engagement at all. And to the extent that these problems can be alleviated through further guidance for competent authorities, it will be important that this contains a strong emphasis on stakeholder engagement and clear stipulations with regards to the matters that will require meaningful stakeholder consultation and how this should be accomplished. Another issue of great importance from a human rights perspective is to protect people from risk of retaliation. Fear of retaliation, and we've looked into that in our accountability and remedy project at great length, is a huge barrier to remedy and to the willingness of affected people to engage with regulatory processes. And given the subject matter of the draft regulation, the provisions relating to protection of people from retaliation are also here, I'm afraid to say, surprisingly vague and weak in our respectful opinion. Safeguards are needed to ensure that information sharing between competent authorities or with custom authorities or with authorities in other states does not inadvertently result in disclosures that could put people at risk. And we have some recommendations for how that could be achieved in an amended version. I'll say just a few words as well about the alignment with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the proposed regulation. The two pieces of regulation are intended to be complementary in two important respects, and others as well, but in two important respects. The proposed regulation applies to all EU economic actors and not just to large ones or those operating in sectors deemed to be high risk, at least initially, and it creates the possibility of new sanctions specifically for cases of forced labor. Unlike in the CS3D, human rights due diligence, as we've heard, is not a specific legal requirement. However, the prospect of orders to withdraw or dispose of products under regulation and the commercial ramifications of this provides very powerful incentives, as also mentioned by Madeleine, to companies to put in place robust human rights due diligence processes and address risk of forced labor in their value chains. Given the extent to which the subject matter of these two regulatory initiatives could overlap, it will be important for competent authorities to be mindful of compliance issues under both these regimes in exercising their decision-making functions, and cooperation and coordination will be key. One area of possible tension that I'll end with, however, could be in the incentives that might be created under the forced labor regulation in particular, to terminate business relationships rapidly because of the commercial and regulatory risks, rather than to work in partnership with other economic actors, making good use of whatever leverage the EU economic actor may have to correct the situation and ultimately deliver better human rights outcomes. Madeleine did refer to the carrot and stick and trying to weigh some of these potentially competing incentives, and we would strongly agree that that is an incredibly important point. giving the competent authorities a broader range of tools, such as the ability to make interim or corrective orders or to agree action plans with the economic actor involved, might be very helpful, might have been helpful as a way of steering companies towards possibilities other than immediate termination in the event that forced labor risks are identified. And as we know, many of them are systemic and may not be remediated or addressed by an economic actor immediately. In the meantime, it'll be important for any supplementary guidance to provide companies with the correct signals on this point. And again, it goes to the collaboration between the competent authorities under the different instruments. I'll end here. We have a lot of guidance also on a number of the points that Madeleine mentioned around the tools for competent authorities, for example, on assessing the quality of human rights due diligence, and we will make sure to share those in the note that will be forthcoming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lene, for all these reflections. That's extremely important when we are looking at strengths and potential weaknesses of this legislation. I mean, we've had several questions and comments. We are not going to be, unfortunately, able to take them all, but I just like to come back quickly before we hand over to Duncan and the panelists, maybe on two questions. I'd like to pass one to Samira. I mean, I think all of you and several of the questions also stressed the importance of coherence, of looking at this forced labor regulation as part of a broader package, especially together with the CS3D, and that there are potentially currently some risks of that being weakened. So maybe if you can tell us a bit more on that and how you're planning to look at the two instruments as mutually reinforcing each other in terms of, on one side, we've got sort of company risk-based due diligence, on the other side, this product-based ban or shipment seizure. There are also several amendments that are currently being put in the European Parliament, which are potentially weakening that coherence and that integration between the two legislations. So if you can come back a bit on how do you see that?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Well, look, I don't think it really helps to focus on the potential negative links or dynamics that can exist, because we have we have the due diligence and we have now the forced labor ban instrument in place. I see it as a very complementary thing here, and the European Commission already did a very comprehensive, detailed impact assessment back then for due diligence. Now, this is exactly what we are building on now for the forced labor ban instrument. I think all the information, the facts and the surveys and the research, etc., that we have in place are very solid, very credible. So I think it is the right approach for us now to specifically focus on the issue of forced labor, taking away an economic incentive within this regulation. And I think specifically this forced labor ban instrument can help sectors like the cacao sector. So it is a sector where, unfortunately, we find forced labor, and I think it really helps such sectors to work on the traceability of the products, and to also do their own due diligence, so that they know where the products are coming from, who they are working with, and how they have been made. I think due diligence as this instrument will help such sectors very, very well. Like I said, especially when it comes to the traceability and being aware and creating the awareness and sensitiveness. I know that a lot of companies in the cacao industry are already trying to do that, and there are already very good examples on how they work on traceability, for example. And I don't think that this regulation will will be more of a negative impact because, for example, we're already working on due diligence. It will actually benefit, I believe, also the producers. And just like, you know, due diligence and this regulation, it all helps together to create a level playing field in the whole union, but also in the whole world. I mean, if we take, for example, the US and Canada, Canada recently has voted for a comparable bill, a new legislation on forced labor ban products. The US already has it for a long time. So you see that in different places in the world, they are creating comparable legislation. So it's also a matter of, you know, basically keeping up with these developments so that we do not only have a level playing field in the whole union, but also outside, to make sure that we can keep up with the competition, and also to make sure that companies itself are protected from the unfair and unethical competition. So I think this only helps. And like I said, the issue of forced labor is a very specific human rights violation that needs specific attention. So I think the European Union in general has a good approach here now by having due diligence for companies, but also to have a specific instrument that is targeting a specific difficult issue.
Thank you very much, Samira. And Madeleine, maybe I'm going to try to capture several questions in one, but I mean, you very kindly explained that beyond the regulation, you've got also a number of tools that are going to come in support, and you stress the importance of the database as one of the key tools, and that's obviously raising a lot of questions in terms of when do you think this database is going to be made available? What sources of data are going to be used? What monitoring systems may potentially feed into the database? How that database is going to relate or not to the EU deforestation regulation database, as well as the level of information that is going to be required. So for instance, is it like for the EUDR farm level data that is going to be needed, or are you looking for something more aggregate? I'm sure you don't have all the answers to that, but maybe some more elements on the database would be useful, and then we'll turn to Duncan and the panelists. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So, I mean, as I said, it is a challenge that we've taken upon ourselves because we felt we cannot throw this out there without stepping up our own efforts to help with that process. So that would be my first remark. One of the reasons, I mean, we're already reflecting on this, of course. We are reaching out to the ILO. They have quite they have a report, but that's not for obvious reasons, not detailed out. It's aggregated. But they're working now on an observatory where there are very interesting things happening, also trying to think of criteria. How can you figure out whether there is a higher risk or not? So I think that the important thing is that we're now reaching out, and we will need the transitional period to work on this, and not only do that in isolation, but also have the necessary consultations with those who want and need to have a say on it, because it's going to be a challenge. Now, the second thing I would say, Rome wasn't built in one day, and I don't think we should try to get in the first step that we do this a perfect thing. There's no precedent for it the way we are looking at it. So all of that will need to be set up with having in mind that we need to have as a principle that this should be a public database. Otherwise, I mean, having it in my room or in the room of a couple of government officials is not having the impact that you need to do, because this is a tool to help you in the assessment whether there's a risk or not. So, and then it's what we always hear is that there's a lot of information out there that is not connected. So I think what we will be trying to do is to, with the help of an external consultant with whom we hope is going to specialize more and more in this, is figuring out what is the information that you can extract. And there are obvious sources. There's an obvious source that there's a US report. Of course, we need to look ourselves, because not all is publicly available information, so or the sources are not always publicly available, but it's an important source. The ILO has an important experience at source, and like that there will be others. I hear from a lot of companies that they also have a lot of mapping and experiences. So I think all of that we should factor in, and then one can look and reflect on maybe different levels of sort of information, so that one you verified it and others not. We need to see what is feasible and how we do that, but certainly in collaborative spirit, how to do that. So that would be my my main answer to your database. That it's really important to keep in mind that it is public. Data protection is going to be an issue to look into. We see that with all pieces of legislation. And then you asked, are we going to be securing coherence? Also, that we certainly have in mind, complementary and coherence for us is a priority. So I could imagine, because you're dealing with supply chain risk, that there will be sectors under the CSDDD that have asked for a particular attention, because also there we will have guidelines. Now, forced labor is covered by both. So we're of course not going to set up guidelines under the forced labor ban that are not compatible, coherent, and we may end up even having a similar trunk of things. I hear it, and it sounds like music in the air. We want to use international standards. As a reminder, the Commission and the EES have issued a practical guide on forced labor in July 2021. And that was an attempt to give hands and feet what the international guidelines, UN, ILO, OECD, what they mean for a practical case for forced labor. And we even at 6 pages, and we had to determine there also when do you disengage or not. That will likely be a source of inspiration for us. And then one can also think, we hear calls for sectoral guidelines. We need to think about it. We certainly want to think further about how can we help good existing initiatives. And you have the COCO initiative, there may be good schemes. How can we translate that as something that builds trust in the system? Not a free card, but that says, look, these we've come across this more often, and this is sort of a good practice that should build confidence that following that, not telling that you cannot vary, it's not a guarantee, because that's another important political point that we need to overcome. There's a big concern that it becomes a free card. But we also need to avoid the chicken and egg story, because you cannot get 100%. We want to catch the big parts. We don't want to have a system that in the end of the day is only complied with by 5%, or that the large majority of people say, I can't comply, it's too complex. So we need to build that in the system.
Thank you very much to all our speakers, Madeleine, Lene, Samira. And now, without further ado, I'm going to leave you in the hands of Duncan. Apologize, Duncan, I think I went far off the time that was given to us. But considering the importance of the subject matter, I think we can probably also go beyond what we initially realistically envisioned initially. So over to you and the panelists. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Matthias. Thanks to all the speakers we've heard so far. We are indeed running about half an hour late, so I'm going to ask our panelists for the next session to be as concise as possible. What we're going to do now is have a short panel discussion to get some additional perspectives into the debate, and I'll invite all our 3 panelists to turn on their cameras. I see 2 of them have already. We have Isabel Adam from Touton, representing the European Cocoa Association, Euphrasie Aka from ICI, Western Central Africa Director, and Fuz Kitto, co-director of Be Slavery Free. I'm going to pose a number of questions to them, and we'll get hopefully fairly concise responses and comments. And then we should have time to open it up to questions from the Q&A panel. I can see there are a lot of questions there already. As Matthias said, we're going to have to overrun the end date at the end time. Sorry if that means people have to drop off, but we'll make the recording available to everyone. So we should have some time to deal with some of the questions in the Q&A panel. But first of all, let's start with our panel of speakers here. And I'm going to put the first question to all of them, which is basically what's good and bad about the regulation? What are the main strengths and what are the main weaknesses? Isabel, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you, Duncan. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, first, to state the obvious, the members of the European Cocoa Association strongly condemn forced labour in the supply chain. And therefore, we welcome the intent and the objectives of the regulation. We welcome the suggested scope, and we think it should apply to all companies, regardless of size. And we also appreciate the risk-based approach, given this very complex topic. However, in terms of members of the industry, there are still a number of elements that need to be clarified in terms of how the provisions of the regulation will be operationalized for economic operators, especially when we're talking about commodities such as cocoa that are produced, by many sectors. If you're talking about shipments that come in or products that enter the European market, the complexity of how that chain of custody is followed and how what happens during investigations of alleged cases or potentially substantiated cases, all these are process-based elements that need to be clarified for us.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Euphrasie. You're muted at the moment.
Hello?
Yeah. Oh, you're back muted again. Sorry, Euphrasie, you're still muted? Yes, that looks good.
It's good. Do you hear me?
We can. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. It's raining in Abidjan, and I hope that you will hear me very clearly. To me, the human rights due diligence gives a more active role to rights holders and the civil society group, including trade union and non-governmental organizations. The risk assessment process gives priority to what needs to be done. This is a very key point. And it's also is a means of achieving a fully responsible and sustainable cocoa supply chain that enables a producer to earn sufficient income to meet the needs, and that mitigates and ultimately eliminates human rights abuses, including child labor and forced labor. And for me, the ICI child labor monitoring and remediation system based on the forced labor mechanism that we have set up in the cocoa sector could be a good approach to address child and forced labor in the cocoa sector.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Fuzz, strengths and weaknesses.
Thanks, Duncan. And I want to start off by saying congratulations to the EU in tackling this, because let's face it, we've known about this for at least 23 years. Rome may not have been built in a day, but my God, it burnt down in 3. So we've seen a lot of burning down of a lot of ideas, and it has taken a long time to come to this. And the EU is what we call the 4th generation of legislation like this. We did a major project year before last, now looking at the emerging legislation or regulations around the world. And it is fascinating. It was a 78-page document. So what EU is doing is a part of a worldwide movement, and it's the movement from soft legislation to hard legislation. I guess my critique of what is there is that it's a good move forward, but it does not go far enough. And if we had a euro for every time we've heard this is complex, we would be an incredibly well-resourced organization by now, but yes, it is. And the only way that I think we're going to move forward, which is it's kind of muted in the proposal, and that is the stakeholder engagement. But I think that the thing about forced labor and child labor is that it's a wicked problem. And I hope people understand the wicked problem, which is wicked problems are things that can't be solved. And I don't think we're actually ever going to solve this. I think it's a continual management that needs to happen and continually evolving. So I think the good part, and I'm talking very generally and because of the time concisely, to say good move forward, but let's understand this as a part of an evolution of what's next. The next generation of legislation is being developed by New Zealand, and they are taking a values-based approach to their legislation on modern slavery, forced labor, etc. And I think that's going to be another step forward about what are the values that you have as society. But in stakeholder engagement, you need more than just governments and business. You need civil society, and the thing that does not come in there is consumers have a massive influence and power within this. And I think that that is one of the things which is not addressed and one which is incredibly important.
Thanks very much, Faz. Okay, now we've touched on this already, some of the speakers have already. The challenges of identifying forced labour and being able to identify products coming into the EU, whether they've been produced with forced labour or not. And of course, in the cocoa sector, this is particularly complicated by the fact that we have child labour, which is not necessarily forced labour. So could I ask our panellists to comment on what are the challenges in identifying forced labour? How can they be overcome in the cocoa sector? And what else is needed in addition to what's in the regulation? Isabel, do you want to start with that?
Yes, thanks. Well, I'm not going to go back into all how complex the supply chain is. I think everybody's aware of that. We are working with many smallholder farmers. And as we've said before, and sorry, Faz, yes, it is complex. It is a wicked occurrence, a wicked reality, and very elusive. And as we're getting better in terms of collecting data, in terms of risk identification, case identification, and potential remedial action that we have, and the possibilities we have as private sector to engage, we realize this is indeed a very dynamic field. It's evolving very fast. And if you look back at the Walk-Free Foundation's Global Slavery Index that was released in May, you see that some of the vulnerability factors that can lead to forced labor occurrence are actually getting even more complex. I mean, we know migration is one factor of vulnerability. That's on the rise, not only for social, political, or economic reasons, but we may see increasingly also due to climate change reasons. So what we should continue to do as companies in the private sector is working with experts, notably the International Cocoa Initiative, but also others such as Verite and others who are contributing to this body of evidence to continue to refine our systems, but importantly, I think to work together. So obviously every company has its responsibilities and needs to have its systems, etc. But we need to address some of these topics much more, I believe, at a landscape level, to engage, and Faz, you made a very important point, stakeholder engagement on the ground and a bottom-up approach, working with individuals, vulnerable individuals on the ground, but also civil society and government structures is key. I'm sure Euphrasie will mention this, but we still need to refine and clarify the national pathways and mechanisms for referral. This is underway and this is going to continue as the dynamic situation evolves. I think the point has already been made several times by others, but if we are to avoid the risk of disengagement, we really need to work closely with producing countries. We are trying to do so on the ground already, but this needs to be reinforced, again, because of the fact that sometimes there's a regional dimension to all this. You need to interact with the national authorities in a given producing country, but also ideally with some of the countries that are sending seasonal workers, for instance, during peak season in cocoa producing countries. Another thing I think we need to look much more at how we capitalize on some of the data we're collecting in terms of risk factors, also in relation to what we see with deforestation risk. I think there's a lot to be done there because some of the risk factors are similar. And then lastly, I'd like to welcome the fact there was a reference, I think Madeleine made the point that as we're looking at this regulation, this important piece of regulation, I think we also need to recognize that there are different realities in respect to forced labor, depending on the context, the geographies, etc. All that is part of how the database is going to be built. But we would welcome, as the cocoa sector industry representatives, the ability to feed into that as well, because the cocoa sector does have quite a bit of experience in addressing child labor. The mechanics may not always be the same, but we think there are possibly lessons to be learned from that experience.
Thanks very much, Isabel. Euphrasie, how would you answer that? What are the challenges in identifying forced labour, and is there anything that can be done alongside the regulation?
Thank you. But before identifying the challenges in forced labor, we have to understand why African countries are so reluctant and are denying the issue of forced labor. The reason is very simple. Regarding our history, most of them have been colonized by European countries, and people have been obliged to perform forced labor. Many people have been beaten and even enchained based on the books we learn at school, and many of them died during the period of forced labor in Côte d'Ivoire mainly. So for them, it's a joke to talk about forced labor because they consider that Europeans are a very bad place to talk about this issue due to the recent past. So for countries that have been colonized in the recent past, the principal challenge is the understanding of the problematic based on the limited knowledge on forced labor because of cultural belief based on our history. So introduce the new forms of forced labor is a real challenge at every level, institutional, national, sectoral, and community level. So to popularize the concepts, indicators, risk factors, and consequences of forced labor in order to improve knowledge of the phenomenon and better preventing in the communities is the key challenge to me. But we have other challenges such as agreeing on the ILO indicators to measure forced labor, the work enforcement of mandate of responsible institutions, the weak legislative framework on forced labor perpetrators, the lack of support systems such as shelters, psychologic, etc. for victims, the lack of national prevalence data on forced labor for decision-making, the weak coordination among actors responsible to address the issue, mainly in Côte d'Ivoire. We are trying to introduce a forced labor working group, and the limited resources to address the challenges in both countries, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, funding, logistics, human resources. According to the complexity of the cases, it might be very costly. So for me, the Union must help the country, showing the good practices in the application of the legislation and ensure that as far as possible that the interpretation and the application of the legislation is consistent between members of the UE, the sectoral directive, the possibility through implementing regulation will be also very useful in this respect. And for me, the EU should develop a framework for member state law enforcement agencies to collaborate with the relevant stakeholders and with equivalent agencies outside the EU. And as ICI, we must continue to strengthen the capacity of the authorities and develop a partnership to address the problematic in the cocoa sector, raise public awareness and train media actors, promote a framework for collaboration with other parties. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. Fuzz, you're a kind of representative from outside the cocoa sector. So is there any regulation or best practice from another sector, legislation somewhere that you can see working that the cocoa sector exporting to the EU can learn from, and particularly given the prevalence of smallholder farmers in the cocoa sector, a particular issue that's not true in all other agricultural commodity sectors? What can we learn from outside the cocoa world?
I guess one is who's in and who's out of the cocoa world would be a really interesting question there, Duncan. We've been involved with cocoa since 2005 and doing a chocolate scorecard, which has now reached about 1 billion reach in the print media alone. One of the things that comes from that has been a lot of people have contacted us from other sectors and said, well, what's happening here? Because we're facing so many of the same issues. Now, there are a number of other commodities that has some parallels. The uniqueness of the cocoa industry is the amount of smallhold farmers. And I think this has been one of the most complex things. Many of the others is plantations, and you can actually move much quicker because your scale that you're working on is much greater. But one of the things that we certainly have seen, and we are looking at again and again, is what are the moves and the not just the legislation. Legislation is just one part of the wedge of tackling this, a very important part. But a lot of it has been worked on as we've been working with rubber gloves, as we've been working with cotton, as we've been working with fishing. And fishing is probably a little bit closer because some of the granular standards being applied, and it's not just getting the standards. The biggest question is, how do you apply them? And I think that's the big challenge to the EU. As we've seen the development of the legislation, we've often said, this is really good. How the heck are you going to do this? And I think that's the big question. So we have seen the WROs withhold and release orders from the USA, and they get down to individual boats. And that's probably a parallel. And that's been very, very effective. Withhold and release orders works on the understanding of rebuttable presumption. And rebuttable presumption has been really, really helpful, which says, look, we've got enough evidence, we've got enough risk factors that we've seen here to say, look, it's rife here. You've got to prove that there's not forced labor or child labor in these areas. And that's been really, really helpful. We've seen it certainly in what's been happening with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act coming out of the USA, which is probably some of the people in the law community there say one of the most radical acts that have come into the USA in the last 100 years. And what they're able to do, particularly in tomato farmers in Xinjiang province, and looking at in that one in particular, and it's kicking in. That has been effective. Laura Murphy from Sheffield Hallam University has been following the Xinjiang one in particular, and the sanctions being put on, and she's just put out a report last week which says these are working. The problem that will also be a challenge into the cocoa industry is if the EU says, okay, we are not going to source from these farms, this area, etc., then it will be sold off to other countries that do not have that legislation. And we've certainly seen that happening in solar panels. We've seen that happening in the polysilicon development out of Xinjiang, but we've seen it in the palm oil, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia and around Southeast Asia. And the standards which are now being applied there are only just kicking in legislature-wise. The greatest one, and certainly what we're seeing, again, through the chocolate scorecard and our other interactions with companies, is that there's a diversity in what the companies understand and don't understand. I mean, you take Isabel, ECA is a good example of what they are doing, but there are many companies that do not understand it. And we've seen that in the other commodities that we work in as well, is that if there's not a congruence across the stakeholders, and that is government, of business, of NGOs and civil society, the standards that might be there are never going to be enforced because of corruption or because of the struggles that is had in trying to work out how it is that we be effective without hurting the companies and hurting the farmers that it's not happening in, but maybe close by, the others. So the standards that are being set around the world depend upon rule of law, and also depend upon the corruption that's there, and also depend upon the willing to actually work together for a race to the top. And I think we've certainly seen that as a parallel in the cocoa industry.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Fuzz. Okay, we have pretty much, we need to take some questions from the Q&A panel, and we've got maybe 10 or 15 minutes left. So if anybody has any further questions, please do put them in. I'll invite Madeleine and Lena from the first panel to join us if they'd like to switch on their cameras, because quite a few of the questions actually relate to the design of the legislation and how it was drawn up. So unsurprisingly, Madeleine might be best placed to answer that, but I'll invite all the panelists to respond. So there are quite a few questions about involvement of others outside the EU in designing the regulation and also implementing it. So perhaps Madeleine and others could comment on to what extent were the consultations with other countries with similar legislation like the US, and also were those countries likely to be directly affected, which of course for the cocoa sector means West African producers, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Latin American producers, and so on. What consultations, what dialogue was them with them, and what dialogue will there be in implementing the forced labour regulation? Madeleine, do you want to go first?
Yes, so thank you. I mean, I could talk hours about this. So we've produced a staff working document. We've had targeted consultations. And of course, we've used any channel that we have had to talk. To give you a flavor of it, so this has certainly not only been business, we've also had civil society organizations, consumers, and others. For the consultations, we've had consultations with UN, ILO, and for the UNGP, ILO, and the OECD to learn about the guidelines and how they see it. So we've had actually quite an extensive one. I think the fact that you don't see articles on stakeholders doesn't mean that they're not important, because they're actually very important. But for the technicalities of the legislation, the input are input. I started getting a call from. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can. Don't worry.
So that was actually quite important to foresee the space with stakeholders in the form of submissions. Of course, this is a ban, so what we need is information to qualify is that a ban or not. But then throughout the process, of course, and we're not specifying each and every individual group, but as the competent authorities were certainly engaged in them, and we do have in mind to indeed elaborate that also in guidelines. As I said, we attach a lot of attention, importance to this network of the competent authorities, which is among competent authorities in the Commission, but we certainly see that also as a space to engage others. So that could be governments and others. I think that is maybe the main one. No, yeah, and then finally, yes, we've had intensive consultations, and we even went there already on a technical mission to the US to gain their system. And we also intend to, of course, an important part will be dialogues with producers. That doesn't come out. We have infrastructure. We work a lot under the Cocoa Initiative and under FTAs or EPAs with third countries. Important vehicle to continue to do that, because indeed they're an important player with it. And I could imagine, to give you an example, if a country is in the risk database. They don't want that. A country genuinely will not want that. So what we will need to develop is what type of dialogue will we then have if you're there, and how. And the obvious question will come up: how do I get off it? And what opportunities are there to work to sustainable solutions? So I would say all over the flavor that we can improve here and there. I fully accept that. But we need to leave space also to the implemented stage and the guidelines.
Great, thanks very much, Madeleine. Lena, I think you have to leave kind of imminently. If you're still with us, do you have any final comments? Or she might have left already. Yeah, okay. So let's not worry about that. Widening out the question slightly for the other three of you, what kind of support, what kind of things do you need the EU needs to do now to work with producer countries in the cocoa sector to make sure the regulation has positive impacts and minimizes negative impacts? Fuzz, do you want to start? I can see you nodding.
Yeah, most certainly. And I think one of the biggest things is actually listen to farmers. A couple of weeks ago, I had 3 weeks in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, sitting and listening to farmers and listening to co-ops and listening to NGOs. And I am continually astounded at the wisdom that's there in the farmers. And one of the questions I asked them was, look, I have the privilege of talking to some of the leaders in the chocolate companies and those in the supply chain. If you were me, or what can I ask on your behalf, what would you like to ask these people? And by and far, I'd say about 80% of them said, tell them to come down and talk to us and understand what's really happening on the ground. So I think that when it comes to producing countries, it's not just about talking to government. It certainly is talking to groups like ICI. It certainly is talking to NGOs, but most of all, it's talking to the farmers and widespread, sitting down to the farmers and saying, look, here's the problems. And instead of being just problem oriented, to be solution oriented and say, what's the solutions here? And I think that would be one of the biggest things that would be critically important to have in seeing the implication of these regulations and legislations.
That's great. Thanks very much. Euphrasie. Again, you're muted at the moment. Still muted.
Do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Deccan. It is very important that EU supports technically and financially the origins countries. Child labor and forced labor are very complex issues that required important investment. The EU needs therefore to increase the investment to help the HIDD in the origin. So the collaboration between all the actors is a key to eradicate forced labor. For me, EU plans to set up a new legislation, so they should be part of the solution.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Isabel, anything to add?
I can only second what Fuzz and Euphrasie have already said. Yeah, no, in the interest of time, I won't go into that. Those are the two main points, definitely.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And so one final question. Again, Madeleine, if you're able to deal with this, and then I'll get responses also from Isabel, Euphrasie, and Fuzz. Quite a few of the questions we've had here are about the need to avoid confusion between child labour and forced labour. And obviously, I think we accept it's important to distinguish between the two, but in practice, how can we make sure, or how can the EU make sure that its regulation doesn't start applying sort of whole scale to any chocolate and cocoa products made with child labour that isn't necessarily forced labour? Madeleine, are you able to respond to that? So maybe Madeleine is away from her camera. The joys of online meetings. Okay, Euphrasie, would you like to comment on that? Euphrasie?
Yes, can you repeat again, please?
Yeah, so what steps do we need to take to make sure that the regulation doesn't end up negatively impacting cocoa and chocolate products made with child labour that aren't forced labour? How do we distinguish between child labour and forced labour?
First of all, they are not the same. Forced labor is very different from child labor. Child labor is the fact of using children inadequately to perform hazardous tasks that could have an impact on the health, the security, and the attendance to the school. the forced labor is a higher denying human. So we cannot put on the same level the issue of forced labor and child labor. So for me, there is no confusion possible. But the fact that it's very new problematic regarding the comprehension of the several actors, mainly in the origin, we have to strengthen the capacity of the all actors so that we will be on the same page on the comprehension of this issue, and try to avoid, I don't know the word in English, but in French is équivoque.
Confusion.
What?
Confusion or risk.
Yeah, I already said it. So for me, there is no possibility to make confusion between forced labor and child labor. And due to the sensitivity of this issue, we have to be careful by trying to put so much pressure on the origins. We have to be pedagogic. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. Isabel.
Well, a bit of the same, actually. There is that, it's very difficult to try and bring that nuance across strongly, not only in terms of child labor and forced labor, but you also have occurrences of forced child labor. So it's education awareness raising needs to continue. And I would argue not just on the ground, which is very important, but also with consumers, because it's easy to lump everything in together, and that can only create chaos and maybe shortcuts on the ground in terms of how you actually address this. And I think also we need to continue working on strengthening the provisions to protect whistleblowers or others that can, raise concerns, notably through grievance mechanisms. And grievance mechanisms need to be reinforced because for the time being, you have companies setting some in place. We have grievance mechanisms at cooperative level. But there are other elements in terms of grievance mechanisms that don't cover, let's say, what we call the direct supply chain, where we have more of a purview, we know what's happening, we have the data, etc. But that's why I'd like to go back to the kind of landscape or regional approach. We need to really start working on those more complex and even more hidden cases. So I would argue that's something we really need to work on with the producing countries, using the bottom-up approach, but also to get support from the EU and member states to help strengthen those systems.
Right. Thanks very much. Fuzz.
I think this is a very important one because certainly Western thinking and Indigenous thinking are very, very different in this. We in Western thinking go for definitions. Does it fit into this box? The reality is all of it is human rights. And so I think the important thing here to realize is that child labor and worst forms of child labor, which is in the UN definition, a form of slavery. So it's not just about forced labor, it's about slavery and it's about human rights. And so it's about the culture, one can lead to the other. Now, when I was in Côte d'Ivoire, one of the things that astounded me was, again, the opening of the Liberian border. When you open up the Liberian border, it's another track in for forced labor to happen. And so it comes back to the question in this is not just about the definitions, and let's argue definitions. We need a language. We're all using the same meaning. I mean, heck, if we can come to an agreed definition on sustainability, we would be so many kilometers ahead. In all of these, there is not an agreed or a common definition so that we can even talk about it accurately. And that's where I think it comes back again to traceability and living income, because forced labor and child labor are symptoms. If we treat just the symptoms all the time, it will just keep on happening. We've got to get back to the causes, which is the farmers getting a fair and just income from the cocoa that they are producing. So I think that's where these all come together as a part of a whole. You can't just look at what definition, what is this or in or out. It's like, it's all human. abuse. And how do we value a human being is the primary question I think we've got to bring into this.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. So that wraps up this session. Sorry for the people who put questions that we didn't have time to answer, but thank you to our panelists, Isabel, Euphrasie and Fuzz, and also to Madeleine for adding in. And I'm going to hand over to Anthony Fountain now from the Voice Network to give some closing remarks. Anthony.
Yes, many thanks there, everyone. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to go through my previously already dictated remarks, because I realize that we're well over time and the really important things have been said by everybody. Basically, I think that this topic has been an important topic since I got into cocoa, which is 17 years ago. And in fact, it was the reason I got into cocoa in the first place, is because of the understanding of forced child labor in West Africa's cocoa farms. That is still an issue, and I think it will remain an issue. Because it's a developmental challenge. So it will remain an issue as long as we have got developmental challenges in West Africa. It will also remain an issue as long as we haven't gotten the sector itself to be completely transparent and traceable either. And so I think kind of going forward on these issues there, forced labor and particularly forced child labor in the cocoa sector remains an issue that is, though in numbers not as large as the other worst forms of child labor that we see. If I look at my country, the Netherlands, if we would find a sector that has 30,000 forced laborers in it, or at least somewhere around that number, it would be a sector that would be under tremendous scrutiny for decades and decades. And so therefore, it remains something that we do have to look at in detail. I think that, as Fuzz said, it's very important that these regulations are being developed. I think that, as many of the speakers said, it's very important that these regulations work together well, and so that we've actually got a suite of interventions that complement each other rather than contradict each other. It's important that they work together well across the world, so not just towards, for example, the United States or Australia or New Zealand or England, but that they also work together very closely with the governments in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana and with the realities there. And as far as that goes, Euphrasie mentions a very important point, that there is a very long history of exploitation by Europe and the Americas of West Africa, and that the term slavery has a very complex and a very deeply felt history in that part of the world. And I think that we also need to approach that with understanding, with delicacy, but without walking away from the current painful realities that are there. And those current painful realities are often also a result of the fact that we're still looking at exploitative supply chains where the actual money is being made elsewhere, but the hard work is being done in countries that are not the countries that are in power of the global supply chains. So I will leave it at the final statements here, saying thank you everyone for a tremendous set of wisdom. The nuance, the complexity, the diversity in the conversations were very important. We're very much looking forward to the next steps that the Commission is going to bring on this regulation. And I think the cocoa sector is looking with a lot of interest at how we can comply to this, but also how we can actually all together with the regulatory, with the voluntary, and definitely also with the poverty alleviation measures that are at our hands, work to actually bring an end to this scourge. And thank you all very much. And I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Back to you, Matthias, I think, to end this off.
No need to. You've done it. I think we're all good. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to the speakers. I hope you find it insightful. We are going to send the recording to all those who registered for the webinar so that you can also disseminate to your colleagues. And we are indeed very much looking forward to the next steps of the legislative process so that we can constructively contribute to the improvement of this very important piece of legislation. Have a very good day and a very good week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.